Salam alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
And I'd also like to begin by just acknowledging that we're here on unceded Mohawk land, and also just to state what an honor it is for me to be here. In addition to being a teacher at Westmount High, I think many of you know that Westmount High has been on the front line of the struggle against Bill 21, as we were in the struggle against the PQ's Charter of Values. And in addition to being a teacher, I'm also actually been named as the candidate for the Green Party in NDG Westmount for the upcoming federal election. And the reason why I've gone into politics is the same reason I have gone into teaching, and that is because I want a better future for the young people in my life. Tonight I'm going to touch on a few of the core lessons that I teach in the various subjects that I teach at Westmount High. The first, and I teach many subjects at Westmount High, one of which is the ethics and religious culture class. And, that's a course where we, part of our job is to expose our students to the diversity of the society in which they live. And so, part of my job is to teach my students about the different world religions and to share with them my own experiences, because I come from a family of Christian ministers. Both my dad and my sister are Anglican ministers. At a very young age, many of my best friends were of the Jewish tradition, and so I was going to bar mitzvahs as a young kid. As soon as before I went to university, I needed to learn more about the world and decided to travel to India, where I was exposed to, people of the Hindu faith and the Buddhist faith and the Muslim faith and Jains and Sikhs. And I guess from all those experiences, one of the core lessons that I bring into my ethics and religious culture class, despite the fact that I'm there to teach them about some of the differences between these religions, I think my core message is what all of these religious traditions have in common. And that can be summed up in one word: love. As some of the other speakers have said, religion is often talked about as a source of hatred in our world and division. But my experience in my life and in my travels is that when I talk to regular people from these traditions, not the leaders, not the people who are maybe trying to manipulate the traditions for a political agenda, all I hear back is, again, that word love. And so, I guess one of my messages to my students is to realize that though there is a lot of, surface difference between these religious traditions, at their core, they're ultimately about the very same thing. So that's one of the core messages I teach in my ERC class. I'm going to move on to my history class. So I'm also a history teacher, and I teach the history of Quebec. And I think, as many history teachers do, I think one of the core lessons in my history class is that, those who don't learn from their history are condemned to repeat it. And that is something I was profoundly reminded of recently when I heard our premier describing, defending Bill 21 with the words, c'est comme ça qu'on vit ici à Quebec. As if this sort of intolerance is part of Quebec's history and part of Quebec's tradition. And I have to say, as a history teacher, I find that to be just an incredibly ignorant thing to say and an offensive thing to say. So just to say a few words about that, I mean, one of the most important events following the British conquest was the struggle over something that was called the Test Act. Where members of the Francophone majority here in Quebec were asked to take an oath of allegiance, to swear their allegiance not to the Pope, but to the British Crown. And as should not have been surprising. Members of the Francophone majority did not want to swear such an oath of allegiance. They wanted to have their religious freedom respected. And it was really out of that moment that Quebec became one of the first places in North America to formally respect religious freedom. And you know, I'm also reminded of this point when I hear members of the CAT government describe Bill 21 as if it's like the logical progression of the Quiet Revolution. And again, to me, that is incredibly ignorant of our history. Because, you know, those who are familiar with the history of the Quiet Revolution know that one of its crowning achievements is the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protects religious freedom no less than the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms does. And you know, this notion that multiculturalism is something that, you know, that has been pushed on Quebec by English Canada, again, is a very ignorant position. In Quebec, we used a different word for it. The word we use is interculturalism, and that is respecting different cultures while also respecting that we need to protect the French language. And you know, that whole notion of interculturalism is being very, very quickly forgotten by the nationalist movement in Quebec. And so I'll move on to the third subject that I teach, and that is a course called The Contemporary World. And it's sort of an introduction to politics. And I begin my course in the contemporary world much the same way I finish it, with a quote from one of my favorite American politicians, actually a guy who ran for the Green Party in the United States several years ago, a guy by the name of Ralph Nader. And his quote is this. He says, "Turn on to politics before politics turns on you." And that quote is, I like to say that to my students because I feel very strongly that that's what's happening in our world right now. Too many of us are saying, politics is not for me. I'm not political. I don't want to be involved in politics. And as a result, I think we are seeing our society and our world being overcome by a series of crises. We are in a crisis of rising inequality, of the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and the middle class disappearing. This is a trend that's been happening in Canada, it's a trend that's been happening in Quebec, and it's a trend that's been happening around the world. And, you know, if this trend isn't stopped, we are soon headed back to a social structure that is not unlike that of feudal Europe, where we have a tiny, tiny elite that controls all the wealth, and with it, very often, the political power.
The princesses.
Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah. And the rest of us will be there to toil in the mud, as they say. We're also in an ecological crisis, and you know, this was mentioned by a previous speaker. You know, the science, you know, some of the best scientists in our world are giving a series of dire warnings to all of us. We are right now in a very, very narrow window where we have to act. You know, the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has said we have about 12 years. Actually, that was a year ago, so we're down to 11 years now. And during that 11 years, we have to get our greenhouse gas emissions dramatically reduced. You know, they're saying in 10 years by 50%, and several years after that down to zero. And if we don't act, we are going to see our world overcome by a series of ecological catastrophes from which human civilization may not emerge. And we are right now seeing the effects of that in the floods that have been happening, around Quebec, in the wildfires that, in the last 2 summers have rendered the air that you breathe in Vancouver to be the equivalent of smoking a couple packs of cigarettes. And in the various, tornadoes and hurricanes happening around the world. And I guess the final crises I have to connect with Bill 21, and that is a crisis of rising intolerance in our society. And to echo the last speaker, this is a crisis that can only be met by all of us rolling up our sleeves and coming out into the streets on these events, by teachers forming human chains in front of our schools, and by making these issues election issues, and by asserting that we are all Quebecois, and that we all belong here. So anyways, I like to think of my job as a teacher as doing a little bit of intellectual self-defense with my students. I see that same thing happening here tonight in the words that have been shared by so many of the speakers here tonight. So with that, I'll say thank you to everybody here.